Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
The Strangest Stories, Volume 7, Story Number 1. In college, I spent 1 month house sitting a large hunting estate in the middle of nowhere, Idaho. The nearest town was 22 miles away. Woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone knocking loud and hard on the front door, and the dogs were going nuts. No way I was going to answer it. I just grabbed the gun and kept quiet upstairs. Next morning, there was a car in the driveway. The guy who owned the car was found dead several months later. I have no idea what happened. It all started back in June of 1987. I know it was 87 because it was the baseball season after the Bill Buckner disaster. My girlfriend's parents owned the place. It was in southeast Idaho. I'm not going to say what town it was. It was 22 miles because they might still own it. And I don't want this to get any more weirder than it already is. It was a pretty big place with a lot of acreage. The guy who was the full-time caretaker for the place had just quit. My girlfriend's dad, he went out there to find a new caretaker, but the new caretaker couldn't start for 1 month. Her dad offered to pay me $1,200 to go out there. Free food, satellite TV, one of those huge dishes from back then, and free booze. All I had to do was keep an eye on the place and feed the dogs and the horse. I had never been out west, so I took him up on it. It sounded better than doing landscaping. I spent the time reading and exploring, playing with the dogs, riding the horse, shooting. Completely uneventful experience until that night. That night, after the knocking stopped and the dogs stopped barking, I eventually went back to sleep. I didn't freak out all that much because there were 2 German shepherds inside with me and I had a gun. I kept it on the nightstand. I had been drinking a little, but not drunk by any means. There were several neighbors that were a few miles away. I was kind of thinking someone just simply drove up the wrong driveway. Next morning, at the crack of dawn, I opened the front door to let the dogs out and see a white Chevy Nova sitting in the driveway. It was near the small cabin for the caretaker. The cabin was about 100 yards from the main house. I called my girlfriend's dad and asked him if he knew anyone with that make and model car and told him about what had happened the night before. He didn't know anyone, and he called the police directly. Police showed up, asked me a few questions, and walked around the property for about an hour or so. The car was locked. The police had it towed. I have no idea if it was broken down or not. There was only one set of tire tracks coming into the house. A few days later, my girlfriend's dad called me up to say the guy who owned the car was missing and to call the police if anything weird happened again. I have no idea who the guy was at all. Don't know how long he was missing or when he was reported missing or who reported him missing. He was just missing. Girlfriend's dad didn't know that much either. After 1 month, I go back home. Girlfriend and I break up shortly thereafter. I saw her out in the town several months later and I asked her if she ever found out what happened to that guy. All she knows is the guy was found dead by suicide 30 miles away. The suicide happened several months after that incident at the house, and he was found a couple of days after he had killed himself. I asked her how he did it, where he was found, who found him, etc., and I got nothing. I never saw her again. You all know now just as much as I know. I feel your pain. Story number 2. I spent an entire year on my cousin's farm in Colombia, a finca. It's very deep into the mountains and 90% of his land is covered in forests. That whole year was basically one massive nope. I can say that at least every other day something completely crazy would happen. One of the things I remember the most was La Ronda. One day I was picking some tomatoes when suddenly the whole mountain goes silent. Not a single animal made a sound. Note that this is Colombia and there are many birds. Anyway, I stop what I'm doing and listen closely because, what the? That's when every effing critter imaginable starts coming out of every hole and every crack and starts hauling ass uphill. Massive tarantulas, huge cockroaches, beetles, mice, rats, etc. Anything that crawled on land, basically. Then the dogs started barking and whimpering. That's when my cousin yelled, La Ronda! La Ronda! which basically means the round, the round. He tells me to get inside the house. He gets the bags out with some sort of poison and starts pouring it outside the house. I then hear what sounds like running water coming uphill from the trees. I looked outside and saw it was probably millions of ants crawling up the mountain and eating every living thing in their path. It was absolutely terrifying. I couldn't see the ground because there were so many of them. Ants, that is. Luckily, the poison worked and they crawled around the house. My cousin was happy, however, because the ants killed whatever pests were around. Story number 3. I was in the army and I was training in Hohenfels, Germany. Platoon was sitting on a screen line conducting an area reconnaissance mission. During the night, the guy on guard heard someone bang 3 times on the left side of the Bradley, which doesn't make sense because you would need another large metal object to make such a noise. Less than 5 seconds later, he hears the same 3 knocks on top of the turret. A few seconds pass, and a high-pitched tone comes through the headset with 3 knocks on the back door of the Bradley, along with someone screaming, "Hey, let me in!" This wakes me up, and one other, and we open the door thinking it's someone in our platoon who was trying to get in touch with us. There was only complete darkness. We waited about 30 seconds, geared up and checked a semicircle around our Bradley, finding nothing. We got back inside and every fault light in the turret is on, with some blinking. They don't blink, ever. The radios were also completely dead. We restarted the turret and everything worked fine. Called over the net to see if anyone was near our area and no one was. Next day we asked the OCs, essentially referees, and no one else was out that night prior. Shortly after, we discovered an old tank half buried and rusted out near our position. We came to the conclusion that it must have been ghost Nazis. Next story. So this happened 3 years ago when I was living with my parents in Meeteetse, Wyoming. Super small and secluded. It was Halloween and my parents decorated the house, and we expected about 3 to 4 kids to show up as the house is about a mile from a subdivision and parents usually drive their kids. At 8, I took in the chair with candy because I figured no one else would be coming around. I'm in the basement where there are no windows and very little sound can get out, and it's about 11. All the lights upstairs are shut off because I'm going to bed. And I hear a knock at the side door, which no one ever knocks at. I went upstairs, and the floodlight, which usually turns on automatically, wasn't on. So I flipped on the other light that lights up the basketball hoop area. There's a person in one of those old man masks that have that crazy hair just standing there. He's just looking at the house. He sprints to the back where the patio is. I hear loud banging on the back windows. Honestly, the loudest kicking I've ever heard. I rushed over and the person is just staring. Then he runs away and I don't hear anything for about 5 minutes or so. Then I start hearing the knob to the main door being forcefully jiggled back and forth. I ran upstairs to the bedroom and went to the crawl space in the attic. I immediately dialed 911. This was the first time I ever dialed 911, so I don't know what I was expecting. But the operator didn't seem to be very shocked or wanting to send out a car very quickly. I remember repeating my address like 12 times, and the lady kept saying, "Calm down, sir." She wanted me to stay on the line, but I'm afraid if the guy got in, he would know where I was because of my voice. I hung up, and I could hear the knob being slammed like he had a hammer or something. I'm having a full-on panic attack, and I'm wheezing, trying to get air. Then I hear the side door, the original door, being kicked super hard. At this point, I'm shaking so bad the dust from the floorboards is flying up in the air. I heard a window smash, and I immediately know he's trying to get in. I held my breath, which makes the wheezing worse. I'm going to die. I'm listening to those footsteps. I'm listening for anything, but then there's nothing. The actual amount of time I spent up there was about 16 minutes. I swear it was an hour. An officer showed up and pounded on the door. I ran downstairs and flipped open the door. I told him everything as well as the backup sheriffs that got there. They all kept saying a friend was probably just trying to scare me. I had no friends in Wyoming. None. They looked around the house and wrote down some shit, but nothing really happened. They left, and I drove behind them to Cody, Wyoming, and got a hotel room. I still can't sleep without all the lights on and a .45 revolver on my dresser. Next story. Three roommates and I went over to a friend's apartment not far from campus, but on a set of apartments in the middle of nowhere. We were just sitting in the living room watching TV, and I got up to put a glass in the sink. Now, there's usually a window over the sink in most kitchens, so I'm washing this glass out. The light is on. There are no blinds in the window, just a curtain. And I heard a sound at the window, and I looked up just in time to see a hand hit the glass flat. I was like 20 years old, but I know I must have squealed or did some kind of scurly scream, and the other three dudes come running in. I told them someone hit the glass. My buddy grabs his hunting rifle and we run outside. By this time, 60 seconds have probably already passed. We got outside and all we see is a bucket laying sideways under the window along with a screen. There was a visible handprint on the window. Breakdown. Someone got a bucket to stand on, took the screen off the window and was trying to open it, when the bucket must have flipped from under them. Outside looking in, you could see through the kitchen and into the living room where we were sitting. This person would have easily seen me standing there literally 3 feet from them on the other side of the window. There were 4 college-age guys inside, and this person was still trying to break in. I wonder who that crazy guy was. Next story. I'm a pretty avid backpacker in the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes I'll hike for days on end without seeing another person. I think it's exhilarating being completely alone. There's really no feeling like it. You get used to it, but personally, I can never help but be on edge. The environment is completely serene and friendly, but there's a constant feeling in the back of your mind. It's hard to put your finger on. Most of the time you'll be chugging along comfortable in your mind, but when you stop for rest or to fill up on water, you can't help but look over your shoulder. Nothing bothers me much out in the woods. I run into brown bears, had elk, trample through camps late at night, and much more. But one night was different. I was on a deep backwoods hike in the late fall off season. It was pretty cold, but the snow hadn't quite started falling yet. I like that. In fact, I usually plan my trips this way. The forest ranger I talked to when I was organizing the trip said I was the only hiker she knew who'd be up there at that time. I was using dispersed camping sites so far off the beaten path that they don't have fire pits. That night was 5 or 6 miles from the trail into the area. I set up camp at a site about 100 yards from a stream, close enough that a faint babbling was audible. I lit a fire, cooked dinner, read for a while, and was settling down to sleep. I lay listening for a while to the sounds of the woods and the creek. Just as I was nodding off, I thought I heard voices. Nothing distinct, no clear words, but clearly a group of people were having a good time, laughing, maybe telling stories around a campfire. A feeling of dread came over me. I thought, I shouldn't leave the tent. Fear like I've never felt before engulfed me. All the hairs on my arms, legs, and on the back of my neck stood on end. I lay there for a while in panic, the voices carrying on, laughing indistinctly. After a while, they receded into the background noise. I still didn't leave the tent. I was too afraid. The next morning, after a very short night's sleep, I searched the surrounding area and the path to the site. The few shoe prints I found were faded and worn around the edges, too old and too few to be from the size of a group I'd heard. I tried to shrug it off as nerves, maybe nervousness, got the best of me, but I couldn't shake a certain tension. I made good time to my next site, the last of the trip, looking around a little more than usual. Still, nobody to be seen. That site had no stream. Dry camping isn't a blast, but it's doable if you pack enough water for cooking and drinking for the night. It was a lot quieter, just the chirps of bugs and the wind rustling the trees. I cooked my dinner and stayed up a good while after dark, sitting on a log, looking at the stars and listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to hear the voices from the night before, but there was nothing. I turned in for the night, stretching every ache out. I lay there restless for what felt like hours. Finally, calm came over me, and then it's back. Nothing threatening or particularly scary, just the sounds of a group of 15 or 20 having a good time, barely audible above the background noise. This time I'm calm, and there's what seems like an internal dialogue in the back of my mind. Why not join them? Sounds like they're having fun. I'd really rather stay here. This is entirely unconscious, and goes on for a while. I'd never experienced anything like this. I was worried that I'd lost it. After a time, the noises faded away into the white noise, and I felt that I was alone. The next day, I packed as quickly as I could and got out of Dodge. During the day, I was more at ease, like I had always been in the past. I was relieved when I got to the car and started back home. I told the story a few times, and every time I felt a little of that dread from the first night. I really had no reason to feel strongly about what had happened. I had just heard strange noises in the forest, nothing extraordinary, but I felt it. On one occasion, I told a story to my teacher who's native. He got quiet for a minute, then said I had run into stick Indians. He said that it was good that I didn't leave the tent. Stick Indians are evil and dangerous because they prey on children and women. The look on his face was sober. He told me not to go back to that place again. These spirits are extremely aggressive and attack and kill at the slightest provocation, including even saying their Salish name, which he refused to do. Whenever the subject comes up, I get that same fear in me. As I think about it, I'm thousands of miles from those sites, and my arms are still shaking. Next story. When I was 15, I was at a Boy Scout camp in Illinois. My tent mate was sick, so he went home on Tuesday. Wednesday night, I'm alone in my tent, and I heard like thuds, between 10 and 12 a minute. I thought little of it and went to sleep. Thursday night, alone again, and I need to go to the bathroom about 1 a.m. I walked up to the latrine, and behind me, I started to hear those thuds. Someone is chopping wood with our troop's axe at 1 in the morning. Someone who then stops, looks directly at me, and then walks away into the woods. I've never been so scared in my life. I heard laughing accompanying the chopping later that night. I reported to the camp staff, and they did an investigation which revealed that others heard what I had, and one had even seen the same thing. And to this day, 5 years later, every theory has come up empty. The wood chopper hasn't reappeared, and it was confirmed not to be a camper or staff member. So, who was it? Next story. I live in an odd little place in Appalachia that was supposedly carved out of the mountains by a meteor. There's a 360-degree view of mountains around me at all times. Well, when I was in middle school, I got really into mountain biking. It was the 90s. So because I was so young and since my mom didn't want me to be on some random mountain path that didn't have anyone on it for months, she would only let me go on deep trails with a guy who owned the bike shop and was also a co-worker as she was a teacher. Well, it had been months since I started doing weekly rides with a guy, Joe was his name, and a few other guys he had rode with. We went up to this place we called Lake Hill, as it was on the road to the city's water supply, which was a lake-sized natural spring. We'd been riding for hours. I mean, like daybreak to probably an hour before dark. We just got to the point where we were going to turn around when we crested this hill, and bam, there stands a dude wearing camo gear, a yellow raincoat in the middle of summer, standing about 15 feet away from a four-wheeler with a shotgun in his hand. Joe, who was the most athletic of us, was in front. I think I'd gotten behind him, and there were two other guys behind me. When you're pedaling a mountain bike up a steepish hill, you're not looking forward, you're looking down, or at least at the ground. You're studying where your wheel is going so you don't run over anything that might ruin your momentum. So when I ran to the back of Joe, I was kind of pissed. I looked up sharply and saw Joe positioning himself between me and the dude. The man said nothing, not one single word. Not a word of comfort or compassion for the fact that we just ran up on him with a shotgun. This is the South. People are hospitable. You don't see two strangers in a deserted place not say hello to one another. I swear, it might be the fact I've played this event over my head dozens of times and want to read in it what I think was happening, or this is really what happened. The guy said, "These mother effers have just found me harvesting my pot. At least this is what I'm thinking he's thinking. What if they tell the cops? Can I afford to take that chance? I don't know. There are a few of them. Shit, that's one's a kid." Because I could see an edge of tension bleeding out of his face when he looked at me, I swear it was him deciding to kill Joe then deciding not to kill me. Joe, to his credit, positioned himself between the man and me the whole time. Eventually, the dude hopped on his four-wheeler, covered in plants, and rode away. I never will forget that taste of exhaustion and adrenaline as we came off that hill. Luckily, in mountain bike riding, the ups are the hard part. We were doing the fastest speed I still have ever done on a bike while in the mountains. I'm actually feeling cold and nervous just thinking about that day. Next story. I spent 3 months in northwestern Utah in 1999 doing graduate field work. I was alone for almost all of it. I read Lord of the Rings, played guitar, laid in the dirt staring up at the stars. All very fun. Anyhow, one night as I was sleeping, I heard a strange noise. Around 3 a.m., that jolted me awake instantly. I was in a tent, and about 30 feet away from me, I heard a grunt that lasted about 4 seconds. Maybe it was a throat clearing. It was an animal noise. Most alarmingly, though, it had a definitely aggressive tone to it. It sounded like a challenge. There were no bears in the area, but mountain lions were possible, although quite rare. I sat bolt upright and grabbed my flashlight. I had no weapons with me other than a small knife, and that was somewhere with a cook gear. I waited, quiet as a mouse, for about 30 seconds, listening for any noise. It was dead quiet. I could have heard anything, but not a single sound. As quietly as I could, but it sounded like when you're opening a bag of chips when you're trying not to make a sound. I positioned myself at the tent zipper, then suddenly yanked it open and shone the flashlight. Nothing. Then I bolted for the truck about 50 yards away. I made it and looked around with a flashlight. Nothing. It was out there watching me, unless it ran away when I ran to the truck. I had the window cracked a bit and watched and listened for about an hour. Nothing. I laid down in the back and tried to sleep, but it was quite chilly, and I was wearing only a pair of underwear and my huge scratchy wool sweater that was luckily in the back seat. The next morning I looked for tracks, but saw nothing, and for the next 6 or so weeks I slept in the back of the truck. Because when you're there, you don't have to worry about anything that makes a grunt like what I heard. Next story. The encounter only lasted a few seconds, but it was one of those "what the F am I sharing airspace with" moments. It was a story my dad told me several years ago. He was in the U.S. Navy, flying P-3 sub-hunters back in the 80s, and was on one of his many flights, jumping from one island to another way out in the Pacific. One point, he was on another one of his long hauls somewhere over the ocean, hundreds of miles away from anything. At about 1 a.m. or so, his co-pilot spotted some kind of aircraft coming from the right side well ahead of them at a much lower altitude. It didn't have any position lights on or anti-collision lights, just a few night formation light strips. They could only see a bit of moonlight reflecting off of it, could tell it was somewhat smallish, as in not a bomber. Sleek and definitely not a B-2, going by now how it looks after the fact. This debuted in 97, or F-117 or any other plane he recognized, but it looked like it would have been a stealth fighter or attack plane for sure. My dad flashed his landing lights to basically say, "Hey, we're flying here. What are you doing?" At this point, the other plane turned off its green nighttime navigation lights and visibly picked up its pace. They got one last look at its moonlit features before it went under their nose. There was no trace of it after that. They flew the rest of the trip assuming they were being monitored very closely. Nothing ended up happening, and they didn't tell anyone, or so he tells me. If anything else did happen, he probably isn't allowed to say. He was 100% positive it was military, but he had no idea what. Whatever it was, he clearly wasn't meant to see it, and he was flying right above it, hundreds of miles away from civilization and thousands away from the mainland. Next story. Back in August of 2006, I was 20 years old and working in a deli near my house, while I also attended a community college nearby. I remember it was a warm summer night and I was working till close, which was 7 p.m., and at the time it was around 6:30 p.m. The only two people left in the deli were my boss and I. I remember I was stocking drinks in the cooler towards the back of the store when I heard the front door open, so naturally I looked, and it was a guy I had never seen before. And working at the same deli for 8+ years, you tend to remember people, and so I figured he might have been from out of town. He had red hair and it almost looked like an afro, which I thought was strange. He walked back towards me and he goes into the cooler and grabs a peach Snapple. As soon as he's walked past me, the smell hit me. So I motioned to my boss and pinched my nose, and he and I had a brief chuckle before I started walking to the front to ring the guy up. I get to the counter, and as soon as I look up at this guy, I felt my stomach drop. His eyes were black, and he had pale skin, and this blank stare. It's hard to explain, but I felt as if he was looking through me and not at me. I asked him if he needed a bag and I got no response. He paid for the Snapple and walked outside of the deli and then stood at the front of the store. So we closed up the store at 7 and we started cleaning up, and 7:30 comes around and I look and this guy is still standing at the front of the store leaning up against the glass. He was so strange that my boss thought he was staking out the place waiting for us to leave, but technically he was a paying customer, so we couldn't tell him to leave just for being weird. So we shut the lights off and we were walking out when my boss turns to the guy and says, "Hey, I don't mind you hanging out here, but please don't lean on the glass." The guy turns to him and doesn't say a word. He just smashes the Snapple bottle on the ground at my boss's feet. And my boss at the time was a big guy. I'm talking about 6 feet, 380 pounds, and covered in tattoos. So my boss gets in his face and says, "What the F is wrong with you, dude? Now you're going to clean that shit up." The guy stares back at him again, not saying a word. The whole time, I'm thinking to myself, this guy is either insane or has the largest testicles on earth. Then, after a few seconds, he turns away, gets in his car, and drives off. I go back inside and get a broom, and I swept it up and called it a night. It wasn't the first time we'd had someone high come into the store. The next morning, I woke up, put the news on, and the first thing I see is that guy's face. Turns out that same night he stopped by our deli. He murdered and dismembered his neighbor right down the street from the deli. The cops caught him pulling up into his parents' driveway the next morning with a woman's severed head in his trunk. To this day I wonder whether or not he committed the murder before or after he came to the deli. I don't remember seeing any blood on him, but then again, I wasn't really looking for any. Next story. This was the creepiest dive of my life. Two buddies of mine and I were on a night dive in the Puget Sound hunting prawns. It was about 1 a.m. and we were about in a good 100 feet deep. The pitch as black you could imagine. We're used to this thing on night dives where we get in a circle, turn off our lights and stir up the water and watch the bioluminescence float around us like floating stars in a black watery space. Beautiful. Only this one time we turn off our lights, stir up the water, and the water glows just enough to reveal a fourth person sitting on our circle. We were at a dive resort, so it wasn't so odd to see another diver, only it was 1 a.m. We'd seen no one else prepping a dive at the dock. He was also alone, which was odd considering the dangerous conditions of a night dive in those waters, and he had no fins or gloves. I don't know how he swam so well without fins, or didn't get hypothermia without boots or gloves. We wore dry suits because it was so cold, but this dude was in a wetsuit with exposed skin, and we thought we saw a giant gash in one of the legs. So the three of us all noticed him, and we're too effing scared to move. I can hear my buddies panting in their regs, and the guy just smiles and waves, then swims away. Whenever you think you're alone and someone just shows up like in an alley at night, it's weird as all get out, especially when you're 100 feet underwater at night. It's absolutely terrifying. Next story. I was a U.S. Army infantryman deployed to Afghanistan in 2006 and '07 on the Pakistan border. I spent the majority of my nighttime deployment sitting outside of the FOB in mounted OPs because the CO thought if we did this, then that enemy wouldn't move at night. Which was ridiculous because nothing happens at night over there. Seriously, they don't have street lights or electricity, so unless it's a full moon, you could trip into a wadi and break your neck, but anyway. So I spent 16 months over there taking turns sitting in the turret of the truck, staring out into darkness, one eye seeing green from NODs and the other seeing nothing from the pitch black. I got very accustomed to viewing the world this way, and if anything moved, my eyes would pick it up instantly. Most of the time it was dogs or sheep or whatever, so no big deal. So 8 months in, I lost one of my best friends to a landmine. One of the worst days of my life. Us being infantry, we got about 2 hours back at the FOB to try to comprehend what had just happened before the CO sent us back out on patrol. So I was sitting there in the turret, staring out into the darkness as usual, thinking about the things that had just gone on. So obviously my mind, it's not in the best place. Regardless, as I'm staring out into the darkness, my non-night vision eye catches some movement off to my right, and I distinctly see the silhouette of a person. This person is moving around the outside of a perimeter, and I figuratively pooped my pants since this hasn't happened at all during my time there. So naturally I snapped my head towards the movement to get a good picture of this person with my night vision to attempt to figure out what kind of crazy local villager is trying to get shot. Nothing is there. So I figured I'm just stressed from losing my friend and calm myself down and settle back in for a rest of guard duty. So I go back to looking straight ahead, and sure as shit, as soon as my eyes get back to 12 o'clock, I see movement again out of my peripheral. Figurative pants pooping happens again. Again, nothing is there through night vision. Still creepy. So at this point, I've about had it with this crazy country and being shot and all that stuff. So I think to myself, okay, let's see what happens. And I turn my head back to 12 and watch out of my peripheral vision, and I distinctly remember the shape of a person walking around the outside of a perimeter. I can only see this dark figure when I'm not looking directly at it, but like I said, at this point, I really don't care. So I sit and watch. As I sat there watching, I get this feeling that I know the figure who's patrolling our perimeter, and I'm filled with the thought that it was my buddy, who we just lost earlier that day. Creepy instantly turned to comforting, and I sat there and watched the movement as long as I could. I still to this day believe it was him, and nothing could ever make me think differently. Next story. This happened to myself and a close friend. Both of us were 23. We decided to go on a 2-night backpacking camping trip in the mountains of New York, and we're both very comfortable with nature and spent a lot of time camping, hunting, fishing, etc. We hiked about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This was not a heavily trafficked area, and we just did not expect to run into anyone. Our first night there, we were sitting around the fire. We saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake around 10:30. This was fairly unusual, however, we didn't think too much of it. But as time went on, this flashlight kept moving around the lake, getting closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night, and we did not particularly want an unwelcome guest. Once it was clear that the person, or people, were heading for our campsite, we moved off into the woods nearby to see who wandered up. I took a small axe with me, and he had a .22 rifle. Now, we weren't expecting trouble, and we certainly didn't want to make any, but we figured we might as well cover our bases. Now, the moment of truth. The flashlight comes near the light of our fire, and it is one man. He has a beard and is probably in his mid-40s. The scary part was he was carrying what turned out to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times and then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he came out and started yelling, "I know you're out there. Why don't you come and say hello?" My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree about 50 yards away. That is when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods, not too far from where we were. He also swung his flashlight around several times. After what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the fire and threw them in to burn. My friend, who had trained a .22 at the man, asked me if I should shoot. I told him absolutely not unless he spots us and starts to point the gun in our direction. Thankfully, the man moved off from where he'd come after a little while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake, ran out, grabbed everything we could fit in my pack, and took off. It was now around 2 or 3 a.m. We ran out the trail with flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately went to the police department and reported it, where we were, who we spoke to, and what happened. We also spoke to some forest rangers. And that was it. I'd never heard anything back from the police. It wasn't mysterious, however. It creeped the heck out of us and makes you wonder just who you can run into when you just go camping. Next story. When I was a teen, I used to go off-roading, mountain biking in the big forested parks in my suburban town. I had been gone for a few hours and was nearing the farthest end of the park. It was starting to get late, and I was deep in the muddied, secluded trails. I turned a sharp corner on part of the trail and saw a man, disheveled, maybe in his mid-40s or 50s, just standing there. I was surprised, and it stopped me in my tracks about 10 feet away from him. The trails were really narrow, and for me to turn around in the dense woods would leave me vulnerable to this guy, if he decided to jump me or something. So I just stood there for a minute. We both looked at each other blankly. I said, "Hi, can I get past you, please?" He didn't say anything for about another minute. Then he spoke. "Would you like a blowjob?" Needless to say, I backed up really fast, spun my bike around, called him a creepy MFer, and rode off. End of story.